Hi everybody and welcome to today's class. Today we're talking about zoonotic diseases. Just a couple of things before we get started in this class. A lot of this class, we talk about these big scientific concepts and we talk about ideas relating to sustainability and some of it can be feeling a little bit abstract. That's not the case with today's class. Today's class is going to be dealing with some issues that are still sort of very much at the forefront of the news cycle at the minute today. And it's going to address some things which could be considered a little bit difficult. I hope that the class is taken in the manner in which I intend to present it, and it's at no point am I pointing fingers at any particular group of people or person, and I don't want it to get overly political, so I'm trying to be as sort of equal as possible. However, there are some things which we just can't gloss over because they are quantifiable facts. So as a result, just a bit of a warning, and I hope you enjoy this class and I hope you learn something from it, and just wanted to put this out at the beginning. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Where is the right one? Give me 2 seconds. Right. Okay, so today's class, as I said, is on zoonotic diseases. And by the end of this class, you guys should be able to describe what a zoonotic disease is and give examples, analyse the threat posed by different potential disease pathways, and also interpret some of the global data on the spread of zoonotic diseases. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, well, what are zoonotic diseases? Zoonotic diseases are any disease that can spread between animals and people. So these might be situations where there is a disease that exists in some group of animal species. That animal species acts as a reservoir, and if people come into contact with those animals, with that particular species, they can pick up the disease directly from the animal. It also includes diseases that start off in one species, then mutate and infect another species, and then they become endemic in that second species. So for example, diseases that might start off in an animal and then they jump, they mutate and infect a person. When they're inside that person, they mutate further, and as a result they become endemic in people and they can spread person to person. So it's basically a catch-all term for any disease that can infect or spread between animals and people. Now, in all cases, these zoonotic diseases are caused by pathogens. So pathogens are the actual agent of disease, and they tend to be little microorganisms. They're broken down to 3 basic groups. So we have viruses. So zoonotic diseases that are caused by viral pathogens are COVID-19. Rabies is a very common one, or sort of ancestrally. We also have bacteria, so diseases like anthrax, which can be passed from animals to people and can be very deadly indeed. That is caused by a bacteria. And also salmonella, which I suspect some people in this class will have had the sort of unfortunate experiences of contracting a couple of times. That exists in an awful lot of animals and can easily spread to people. However, they're not just viruses and bacteria. We also get protozoans. So toxoplasmosis, which is a disease we'll talk about a little bit later on, that is a type of protozoa. And also one of the most deadly disease, or the most deadly disease on the planet, malaria, is caused by a plasmodium, and that can be transferred between humans and people. There are other pathogens that can jump backwards and forwards between humans and animals. Multicellular parasites such as tapeworms and flukes. It is possible to contract tapeworms off your family pets or off farm animals. Liver flukes, they are one of the reasons why in the USA pork is cooked so well done, because people are so terrified about liver flukes. And also there are fungal pathogens that can jump between humans and people. If you've worked on a farm and you've ever contracted ringworm, that is a type of fungal pathogen that is present in a lot of farm animals that can jump into people. One of the things that's critical to notice here is that these are zoonotic diseases caused by pathogens. So we might think that, okay, zoonotic disease is just any way that an animal and a human can negatively interact with each other, but that's not quite true. Like a dog bite, for example, is not a zoonotic disease. That's just an injury. So these are pathogen, so the actual organism itself that causes the disease, is called the pathogen. So for example, this is the rabies virus, this is what it looks like. This is the pathogen itself, and rabies is the disease that it causes. So there's a slight sort of thing between the pathogen, which is the organism that causes the disease, and the name of the disease itself, which is often based on the symptoms. Now the thing to remember is pathogens are alive, they are a living thing. And because they're a living thing, they are subject to evolutionary selection in just the same way that Darwin's finches were subject to evolutionary selection, and they went through an adaptive radiation. When the finch landed on the Galapagos Islands, it evolved into lots of different species. In the same way that plants are subject to evolutionary selection, they are a living organism subject to evolutionary processes. And this is critical, because what that means is individuals that can make more copies of themselves, so reproduce a lot, are more successful. In the same way that a bird that has some particular characteristic or trait that makes it able to collect more food, it's going to do better in life, it's going to produce more offspring. Those offspring are going to carry the trait of that parent bird. It's exactly the same with pathogens. Individuals that can make more copies of themselves, that can reproduce more, are by definition more successful. So if you're a pathogen, different host species represent new opportunities for infection and reproduction. So think about this, if we go back to the sort of concept of islands. If you're a bird that can potentially move between islands, each one of those islands represents a new opportunity for you to colonize a whole new area, which might mean there's new resources. The island itself is naive to you being there, so the seeds are probably easy to eat, or the insects are easy to eat. As a result, these new islands represent new opportunities for you to grow and reproduce. And with pathogens, we can almost think of different species, different potential host species, as being different islands. Every new species represents new opportunities for infection and reproduction and increases the size of your potential range. Let's just go through an example. So we're going to talk about a disease that we find it first off in this initial host. So this is a little sheep, and this disease in its initial host, this is a disease that is endemic in sheep. So it's a disease that's been existing in sheep for a long time. So the disease quite happily pops around in sheep. However, sheep don't live on their own. So a sheep tends not to live isolated on its own. It lives in flocks, where you've got lots of other sheep, and it also often exists on farms, where you have other animals. So let's put the sheep, rather than existing on its own, into a farm. So we have our initial host still, our little sheep. It's our initial host, so this is sort of patient one, with disease that's endemic in the sheep. Now, because it's in a group, the disease spreads to new hosts. So now we have 3 infected hosts rather than 1. However, because this disease is endemic in sheep, that means that some of these other sheep might have experienced the disease before and they've recovered from it and they're now immune. Or sheep might just have some individuals within the species just have some natural innate immunity to this because the disease has existed in this species for a long time. So as a result, some of the sheep have a natural resistance to it because they've had the chance to evolve a natural resistance to it. So we now have our 3 host sheep. However, then the disease mutates and jumps from sheep to now being able to infect cattle that the sheep are interacting with. So what this means is this pathogen that was inside this host went through a small mutation, and now it's able to infect cattle as well as sheep. So it mutates and jumps a new species. So that eventually just increases the number of hosts by 1. So now we've got 4 hosts. However, because it's now infected a new species, this species is naive to this pathogen. It's not encountered it before. That means it has none of individuals in that species have experienced the pathogen before, so they haven't had a chance to build up an immune response. And because they haven't evolved with the disease, they haven't got a sort of natural innate immunity to it. So because they're naive hosts, the disease now rapidly spreads through this new naive population because they don't have any resistance to it. So we've rapidly jumped from 4 to 10. So we can see this is what we call a logistic increase, an exponential increase in the number of hosts, where we go a little slow increase and then a massive jump, because it's been able to jump species and infect a new naive species. So this now have the pathogen is now really common in this new species. Then we can say, well, this pathogen might mutate and jump again, and it infects a third host species, which is now humans. This is actually quite common, the idea of a pathogen jumping from one species and then being able to rapidly jump to another species, because the individual, the pathogen that has jumped, that has made itself, in that process of doing it, it's probably become more generalist. It's become better through evolutionary selection of just being able to infect novel hosts. Rather than being tailored to one species, it's become more generalist and starts to be able to affect other hosts. And so now, after it's jumped once, it increases the probability that it can jump again. Now we have 11 hosts. Now this might sound like a very sort of abstract concept, but this is actually the story of a disease that started off in sheep called scrapie. From scrapie in sheep, it jumped into cattle, and it became known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE, which is affectionately referred to as mad cow disease, you might have heard about. Mad cow disease then subsequently jumped into humans and became Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD. Now what's interesting is that scrapie had been present in sheep for a very, very long time. So 100 years, well over 100 years. Scrapie jumped from sheep into cattle and then became BSE, and then within the space of a year or two, it then subsequently jumped into people and became Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Now this process of jumping from sheep to cattle to humans, that part of it occurred in the 1990s. However, fortunately, when it got into humans, the pathogen never really evolved to affect humans well. So even there was like less than 1,000 cases per year in the USA. It's absolutely awful when it does get in, but it didn't get into humans all that well, which was quite helpful. So we now start to ask the question of, well, why can pathogens that jump species be so dangerous? Well, the critical thing to remember here is that pathogens, the little organisms, the little microorganisms that cause the disease, those pathogens do not want to kill their hosts. Because if they kill their host too quickly, they kill themselves at the same time. Because a dead host is a dead pathogen. If you're a pathogen that needs to live in a living organism, if the things that you do to that organism end up causing mortality in that organism dies, you die with it, and all your offspring that are present in that host. So the pathogen does not want to kill its host, and it certainly doesn't want to kill it quickly. It wants to keep the host alive long enough to infect other people. Now, a pathogen and its initial host may have evolved to live with each other. They may have gone through many generations of living with each other, and so the pathogen infects the host mounts a bit of an immune response and is able to keep the pathogen down, but the two just have sort of been co-evolving for hundreds if not thousands of years. However, a new host, when the pathogen jumps into a new host, that new host is naive. Its immune system can't cope with this new threat, and so as a result, this new pathogen has a very high transmission probability and very high levels of mortality. Because the pathogen is evolved to deal with this in its initial host. It's been able to jump in. It might mount such a strong pathogenic impact, it kills its new host, which it doesn't really want to do, but it's an unfortunate side effect. And we can see this in a whole bunch of diseases. So let's have a look at Ebola. So if we look at the Ebola virus, the Ebola virus is present in a lot of bat species. It causes asymptomatic infections. So in some parts of the world, especially in Africa, if they test a whole bunch of these bats that are flying around, they have a very, very high level of Ebola virus infection within bat colonies, especially because bat colonies tend to live in very tight-knit groups. However, within these bats, they have Ebola virus, but the infection tends to be asymptomatic. The bats are able to live quite comfortably with the Ebola virus. They can fly, collect food, mate, do all the normal bat things, even though they're infected with this Ebola virus. And Ebola is one of those viruses where the moment somebody says it, people go, "Ugh," and start to get scared. So Ebola virus is asymptomatic infection is common in bats. But when you look at primates, Ebola is associated with a 75% mortality rate in chimpanzees, a 95% mortality rate in gorillas, and a 25 to 90% mortality rate in people. So this is a virus that's asymptomatic in bats, but is really deadly when it infects primates, especially great apes. So for a long time when Ebola virus outbreaks took place, people thought it was a virus that was jumping from primates, so chimps, especially great apes like chimps and gorillas. People thought it was jumping from primates and infecting people. What it actually looks like is that bats might be the sort of initial host, and then it's jumping from primates, and so it's killing those an awful lot, even though bats are essentially acting as a reservoir of this disease. So it's when it jumps species, it jumps into these naive species that don't have an immune response to it, and so it causes enormous levels of mortality. So let's think about it this way. Given that these species, a pathogen jumping between species can be so dangerous, well, how do we minimize the risk of a disease jumping species? Well, every contact between members of a different species is equal to a possibility of jumping. So if you have an infected species and it's coming into contact with another species, every time individuals of those species are in close proximity, there's a possibility that a pathogen can jump. Now, even if that possibility is incredibly small, which it is in some cases, lots of contact between species increases the chances. So let's think about one of these examples. So here we've got a chicken and a person. So chickens, as a lot of birds, can contract bird flu. So we think about the probability of it jumping. So e.g., the probability of H5N1, or bird flu, jumping from a chicken to a person from one contact is about 0.00000000029. This is a tiny probability. It's comparable to a lottery win. So it's a tiny probability of it jumping. It's about 3 in 100 billion, which is very small. Because this is the probability of the virus, of the pathogen jumping, the probability of it not jumping is just 1 minus this number. So the probability of it not jumping from a single contact is 0.9999999999971. So that's a very large number. It's incredibly close to 1. That's the probability of it not jumping from one single contact. But let's have a think about a slightly different farm. Now, rather than having one chicken and one person, we have one person and 10 chickens. Because we have 10 chickens, we have 10 times the risk. So now the probability of the disease not jumping is now 1 minus 0.000000029 times 10, which is still a very low number, but it's still 10 times bigger than this one. But with our person hanging around with 10 chickens, this probability is still tiny. I mean, this is absolutely microscopic. This is still a lottery win sort of probability. But this is one person and 10 chickens. We can see that it's 10 times greater than one person and one chicken. And how many chickens are there in the world is the question. Well, the global population of chickens is about 25 billion chickens. So there's only 7 and a bit billion people, so there's more than 3 times as many chickens in the world as there are people. That's something to think about. So the probability, given there's 25 billion chickens, if we do 25 billion contacts between people and chickens, the probability of the disease not jumping is now 1 minus this number times 250 times 25 billion, which is 0.925. That might seem small, but that means so globally, the probability of the disease jumping between chickens and people just once is 0.075. This is about 1 in 15. And this value of 1 in 15 is why we keep getting outbreaks of bird flu all over the world. There's one going on right now. It's just recently been detected in the UK and Russia. Even though we know the probability of any one contact between a chicken and a person is a very low probability of bird flu, because we have so much contact between chickens and people, even though the chance of it jumping on any one occasion is in the hundreds of billions, because there's so many contacts, we keep getting diseases jumping, because even though the risk is tiny, we're doing it so often that we keep getting outbreaks. Because every close contact between a person and an animal poses a risk. That risk might be tiny, but if we have lots of contacts between people and animals, it massively inflates the risk. Okay? So let's have a think about what species do we regularly come into contact with? Well, two of these are cats. So our domestic cats that we have running around in the house carry a disease called toxoplasmosis, which is a plasmodium. It's a type of protozoa. And toxoplasmosis is common in cats. It causes, when it infects other species, it can cause heightened aggression and things like that. Toxoplasmosis is very common in the US. So about 9% of Americans have contracted it from cats. So almost 1 in 10 people is infected with toxoplasmosis, and they got it from their cat. You cannot transmit toxoplasmosis between people and people. Well, you can, but the process is horrendous, and we won't go into it. In addition, one of the big ones that gets us a lot is salmonella. So salmonella, we currently have about 1.35 million infections of salmonella in the USA per year. Most of these infections come from food, from either eating undercooked food or from contamination between cooked food and uncooked food. This is why in your fridge you're meant to store cooked meat and uncooked meat very separately from each other. But in recent years, not only have we had it from uncooked food, but there's been a big increase in salmonella infections from backyard chickens. Chickens carry salmonella, and people have started, it's become a lot more popular to have chickens in your backyard, so you get fresh eggs all the time. There's now an increased incidence of salmonella outbreaks from people having chickens in their backyard, because as you go in to feed the chickens, as you go in to clean out the chickens, you're coming into contact with chicken poop. That chicken poop is getting onto your shoes, it's getting into your hands. That means you're then bringing it into the house when you track it back into the home. That then means the pathogen is present in your home, and you can easily transfer it to uncooked food. So it is happening. So in addition to these sort of animals you might have at home, we start having a look at farm animals. And farm animals can carry an awful lot of different zoonotic diseases. So some of the really nasty ones that people have heard about is anthrax. That's a really high mortality rate, to the extent where anthrax is actually used as a biological weapon. We also get brucellosis, dermatophilus, E. coli, pseudocowpox, Q fever, ringworm, and TB can now jump between some farm animals and people. If you own sheep in particular, you might have had a viral disease called ORF. This is a small viral pathogen that can get onto your hands, and it just causes these sort of lumps and sores. It tends to go away of its own accord very quickly, and you only ever get it once in your life. I was raised on a farm in the UK, and pretty much everyone we'd ever met had ORF at some point. It's such a common zoological disease. Most farmers consider it just it's an occupational hazard. So we've got loads of diseases that can jump between farm animals and people now. But many diseases come from cattle and other farm animals historically. So if we look at a lot of the pathogens that we now consider human diseases, we can actually trace their origins back to other domesticated animals. One of the big ones of these is measles. So measles is thought to have jumped from a disease called rinderpest, which is present in cattle. in about 600 BC. So we've domesticated farm animals for millennia. And over the course of that domestication, many diseases have jumped from farm animals into people. And yeah, measles is one of the really big ones. And if you look at the genomics of the measles virus and you look at the genomics of rinderpest, you can see that's an incredibly similar virus, and they can track in the same way that we did phylogenetic trees earlier in this class. You can do the phylogenetic tree for measles and rinderpest and a suite of other viruses, and it looks like they diverged, they split from each other about 600 BC. So it's thought that's when measles jumped from cattle into people. It's subsequently become endemic in people. Other species we regularly come into contact with that we might not want to, rodents. The rat population is usually higher than the human population in cities, as with the mouse population. Rodents get in very close contact with us, they end up living in our houses and all sorts of stuff, and they carry all sorts of diseases. Some of the ones you might have heard of is things like hantavirus, hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, that can be really nasty, Lassa fever, leptospirosis, salmonella again, tularemia, and the modern one that's come out recently, relatively recently in the 80s, is Lyme disease. So Lyme disease has been present in the white-footed mouse for a very long time. In the 80s, it started jumping and started being able to affect people. One of the really big ones, so rats were responsible for the biggest pandemic the world's ever seen in terms of number of people dead. That was the plague. Killed about 25 million Europeans in 1665. Although that's a lower number than were killed by the Spanish flu in the early 20th century, at the time the population of Europe was much lower, so 25 million Europeans was 35% of the continent of Europe died in the plague. So that's 1 in 3 people living in Europe died because of a disease that was able to jump between rats and people. So that's a big deal. Other species we come into contact with that we might not think about so much are bats. Bats carry a whole bunch of diseases, including rabies, SARS, a whole suite of coronaviruses, which include SARS, lyssavirus, and salmonella. Bats themselves, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail now, are problematic due to a reason we wouldn't think about for rodents, is because of their guano, their flying. So that means while rodents, okay, they can do little poops and they leave them on the floor and they leave them in certain places. Bats are flying, which means that poop rains down from above and can get into a lot of places that mouse and rat poop can't. So they produce this guano that rains down from above. They often, in some cases, live in very high abundance. So bats form these roosts where they all sleep together. So you get very, very high abundance. That produces a very large reservoir of disease. Also, in some places, bats live in very close proximity to people. And in addition to this, sort of those characteristics, the virology of bats is also an issue. Bats have a very unique immune system. And these immune systems are tailored to mount just enough defense to keep viral levels low, but not trigger an over response. So when bats get infected with some pathogens, their immune system kicks into gear to reduce the load of that virus, to sort of lower the abundance of the virus in the bat's body, but not trigger what we call an over response. So a lot of the times when people die especially from a virus, it's not the virus itself killing the person. The virus isn't destroying the person's organs and things like that. It's actually the person's own immune system desperately trying to fight this virus that causes such a heavy stress on the person that it ends up killing the person. This is how people tend to die from flu. It's not the flu pathogen themselves destroying their organs, it's their own immune system desperately trying to get rid of this new pathogen that ends up killing the person. You will have felt this yourself when you get some diseases, especially like flu. So if you get flu, you get a fever, you get aches, you get chills. That is not the pathogen causing directly those symptoms. It's your own immune system desperately trying to get rid of the virus. So the reason your immune system gives you a fever is because it's like, okay, there's this new thing inside us, let's try and cook it. And so it raises your fever super high. And in some cases, that increased fever can actually become fatal. So it's pretty nasty. But in bats, their immune system is tailored just enough so it keeps the virus low, but not trigger this over-response. And this is the reason why bats are able to carry some incredibly dangerous viruses that would kill us. Things like Ebola, SARS, COVID-19, and a suite of other viruses without necessarily getting sick. So this becomes problematic because their virology means they act as this long-term reservoir of disease. Bats also have high-density roosts near people, which is problematic. And me and my wife were most highly introduced to this when we lived in Brisbane, Australia. So this is a picture of Brisbane. Brisbane is a large city, 2.3 million people. It's an absolutely beautiful city, stunning areas of green inside it. This amazing river running through the middle and these beautiful buildings. So it's home to 2.3 million people. It's also home to between 500,000 and 1 million flying foxes, which is the world's largest bat. So this is what the flying foxes look like. They are enormous. Their wingspan gets up to about 4 to 5 feet, and their body length is about 1 foot to 2 feet. They are stunningly beautiful animals, and they live in these enormous high abundances. And in the city at night, especially if you go out in dusk, you get thousands of these things flying in these gigantic flocks backwards and forwards. And it's a really quite spectacular sight. Some of the bars in Brisbane as well, if they have an upper deck with trees nearby, people will go out and sit and have drinks, and you can watch all the bats flying into these trees. It's really kind of cool. But these bats also tend to roost in parks in the city and sometimes in people's gardens. Brisbane's a very green city with lots of these beautiful gum trees, and the bats love to roost in them. These bats, while they're roosting, they produce enormous amounts of poop. So you can get up in the morning, and if a bat roost has decided to just take up residence in the tree above your car, you wake up in the morning and this is what your car looks like in a single night. They produce astonishing amounts of poop. Some cases, a single poop can be enormous in itself. We once woke up in the morning and I came out to the car to find literally a cow pat on the hood of the car. So these bats, they live in very high densities in a city among people, and they produce these enormous amounts of poop. Imagine if that just lands in your garden and your kid wakes up in the morning and decides it wants to go and play outside. Before you've checked, you can find, or before you have the chance to clean, you have this situation. It can be pretty problematic. So as a result, bats are in this very unique situation where they can be a real source of these zoonotic diseases because of their virology, because of their proximity to people, because of their high densities, and because they're flying and they're above us, so poop rains down from the sky. Okay. So let's have a think about, so more generally, so in the recent years, we've actually observed more zoonotic diseases arriving and becoming widespread than we have done sort of historically. And there's many reasons why this might take place. One of the big reasons globally and specifically here in the US has been urbanization. So as the population of the US has grown, and especially the increase of the middle class, people have decided to move out of the cities and move into the suburbs. Increased access to transportation has really made this possible. So rather than having the sort of high rises in cities, we're now going for these sort of suburban housing estates. And this suburban encroachment into wilderness areas increases contact with wildlife. Because this used to be, green wilderness. Now it's full of people. They've encroached into this area that was previously a wildlife habitat. But critically, when they move into the suburbs, they don't produce the hardcore urban landscape we associate with the inner cities. So we maintain lawns and hedgerows and shrubs and trees and green spaces. So we maintain a little bit of natural ecosystem. This encroachment into wilderness areas massively increases contact with wildlife. So a big example of when this became problematic here in the US is Lyme disease. So Lyme disease has been present in the white-footed mouse for a very long time. It's spread by deer ticks who, when they're larvae, they infect these white-footed mouse and contract Lyme disease. But the encroachment in suburban areas in the East Coast, specifically in Connecticut, increased massively the amount of white-footed mice that were coming into contact with people. And because we had increased contact, increased transfer of ticks, eventually Lyme disease was able to jump from mice into ticks, and it now regularly infects people. Globally, one of the other big issues and way that we get increased disease rates is through markets, and specifically live animal markets. I don't want to be pointing fingers, and I don't want to be accused of being anti-anything, so I just want to highlight, first of all, that I am from a farming family. I have taken place in lots of agricultural shows. I was raised on a farm from the ages of 5 until about 20. I've been employed on farms. I've been around farms for an awful long time. But these farm markets are a source of increased disease rates. Here, for example, is a picture of my father at an agricultural show with one of our prize sheep. And you can see, so normally on a farm, you have a whole bunch of sheep and one person or a couple of people managing the farm. But at these markets and agricultural shows, you're having hundreds, if not thousands of people come round. And they want to touch the animals. They want to be in close proximity to the animals. As a result, you're massively increasing the contact between people and animals. This is also present here in Logan. We have the Logan County Fair, where this is taken from, where we have, again, these animals that are normally in wide open spaces, and they only have one or two people with them. Suddenly they're in very cramped conditions, and also they've got lots of contact between humans and animals. So as a result, you're increasing these contacts. So what happens is these county fairs and agricultural shows, they end up putting large numbers of people and animals in very close proximity, which, as we now know, is not good for zoonotic disease transmission. And so these county fairs and agricultural shows are associated with increasing numbers of E. coli, Salmonella, and Campylobacter outbreaks. Historically, they've also been associated with swine flu, bird flu, and even in some cases, rabies. So live animal markets here in the US and in Europe and all over the world, they're presenting this sort of wonderful situation where we've got lots of contact between people and animals, which is perfect breeding ground for zoonotic disease. However, in addition to the sort of agricultural markets you might be familiar with, there is a different sort of market that takes place all over the world. And these are the live animal markets that are very common in developing nations. These live animal markets are very popular because it's a way, especially in a hot climate, to keep food fresh without the need for refrigeration. So when in the US, the live animal markets we see tend to be agricultural shows and county fairs. They're often people buying animals for breeding. They might be taking them home, or they might be selling some animals to slaughter, but they're going into a wholesale, like you buy a whole bunch of sheep and they go into a meat packing plant and get consumed. These live animal markets that we get in a lot of developing nations are selling live animals directly to the consumer. So what they're often doing is they have these live animals for sale in a cage. You buy one of those and you kill it at home that day and then you eat it. The great thing about this system is it does keep food fresh in a tropical hot climate without the need to refrigerate. So if the animal that was in here, so this looks like a little monkey, if you killed this and you put it up for sale, in the climate this is in, that meat would be rancid, certainly within a day, possibly within sort of 6 to 7 hours. If you keep the animal alive, technically that meat is going to remain totally fresh for days, if not weeks. So you can keep taking the same monkey back and having it for sale, and it can keep going, and the person that's buying that monkey knows it's fresh, knows they're not going to catch salmonella or something like that. In the third world, in the developing nations, these live fish markets are very popular and safe. So this is actually my favourite live fish market that I've ever been to. It's in a place called Kota Kinabalu in Malaysia, on Borneo. It is absolutely amazing. They've got a whole bunch of these different fish. taken from all over that coastline, and you basically, as this little chap who's just got off his motorbike, you go and you pick your fish. You can actually have that fish and they will literally sell it to you while it's still alive. Or many of these little shops also have a kitchen associated with it, and they will prepare that fish in the speciality of the kitchen, and you get this amazing meal on the plate of fresh fish. It's absolutely lovely. So these live fish markets have been going for years. I've encountered them in large parts of Asia and some parts of Latin America, and also continental Europe, so Portugal and places like this. They're very popular and safe. You've probably encountered these in restaurants here in the US. Red Lobster is entirely based off selling live shellfish. That's its entire shtick. It works very safe and it works very well. In recent years, there has been an increase in switching from live fish markets to terrestrial wildlife, such as, here we've got monkeys, a whole series of birds. I don't know what that is. I'm going to assume this pussycat is actually going to be a pet, but we have these live animal markets for terrestrial wildlife, which is becoming more problematic. As I said, though, you've probably encountered these sort of live fish markets. Yeah, Red Lobster, that's the best way to keep lobster, crab, shellfish. Best way to keep it fresh is to have the live animal in the tank until somebody orders it. There is also a great live animal market in Salt Lake City, the Chinese supermarket in Salt Lake City. This is by far the best place for seafood in Utah. Me and my wife go there probably at least once every couple of months. You have this seafood counter. This is all frozen seafood on ice, but they also have shellfish and they have Dungeness crabs, Maine lobster. So these are from the Pacific, these are from the Atlantic, and they have BC spot prawns. It is by far the best place for seafood in Utah. So these live animal markets, we might like to think there's something from other parts of the world, but we get them here an awful lot. Now, the reaction of, you might think, well, if these live animal markets could be so problematic, well, we should ban them. Banning live animal markets straight away, and it means that we get rid of some of these zoonotic diseases. But banning live animal markets may have serious consequences. The big thing is, meat and fish, if you've killed the animal, would need refrigeration. And this is very difficult, very expensive, and it's very problematic in some parts of the world. In addition, if you've killed the animal and you're selling it dead, the level of freshness of that product is very hard for a customer to understand. So you compare that between, so these are Maine lobster kept in a tank where they're alive and you can see them all moving around, compared to if you have a lobster tail that's processed and in the sort of fridge in the food section. Me personally, I come from the UK. In the UK, it's very difficult to sell a person from the UK shellfish that is not alive or cooked. People will buy live lobster, they'll buy live crab, they'll buy live mussels, but it's very, very difficult to sell them processed and chilled dead parts of these animals because we just don't trust them. Because I look at this lobster and I go, okay, this guy down here, he's about the right size, he's alive, he's running around, he's super fresh. This, I don't know how that lobster was, what condition it was in when it was processed. If a lobster dies in a tank like this, the meat is rancid within a couple of hours. But do you honestly think if a lobster died in a tank, a person wouldn't still cut off its tail and process it like this? Because this is a very high value commodity. So this I know is fresh. This I have no idea about, and I will not trust it at all. I'll buy lobster quite happily out of a tank. I will never buy them either frozen or chilled in the fish counter because I just do not trust the freshness. It's such a gamble. So we have this situation where banning these live animal markets gets rid of, it means it's very hard for us to understand how fresh it is, and also refrigeration is a real problem. This is an example from here in the US, but in tropical nations it becomes even more problematic. Because if you've got things like these meat counters in the tropics, this is going to go rancid very, very quickly indeed, especially when this is not refrigerated. The only cooling this meat is receiving is this sort of little fan that we've got here, which is not going to be doing a great deal. As a result, because it's not labelled and it's not refrigerated, foodborne illnesses from these meat products can be a major problem. So although banning live animal markets might reduce zoonotic diseases, it can monstrously increase things like listeria, salmonella, and things like that. Now, one thing to remember is, although these diseases can be very problematic and can be very deadly, those foodborne illnesses tend not to be transmissible in the same way something like bird flu or COVID-19 is. Although somebody might catch listeria from eating slightly rancid meat, it's going to infect that person. That person is not then going to go around infecting other people, which they would do with swine flu and things like that. So, although banning of live animal markets could cause health issues, there's lots of backwards and forwards, and there's lots of sides to this argument. So, the next question then becomes, well, how do we reduce the chances of zoonotic outbreaks? One of the really big things that we have to think about is, and this is priority number one, is minimize contact among exotic species in stressful conditions, and also minimize contact between exotic species and people. The reason why we want to minimize contact among exotic species in stressful conditions is because if animals are placed in conditions like this, they become very stressed out. And if you become very stressed out, that weakens your immune system. And your weakened immune system means you're more susceptible to disease. And it means that if disease gets into you, that disease can reproduce better and you can pass it on much better. So placing animals in stressful conditions increases the chance they themselves will get disease. And also, because they're in very close proximity, that is increasing the chances that the disease can jump between species. So here, for example, we've got some chickens, we've got some other birds, we've got some quail, we've got these monkeys, we've got pussycats, and who knows what's in there. That looks like a civet up there as well. So we've got these different species in high stress conditions, very close proximity. This is basically generating a selection pressure for a disease in this monkey to be able to jump and infect a civet, a cat, and a chicken. And remember, all of these animals have weakened immune systems. They're more susceptible to disease. So what you're doing is you're placing a lot of stressed animals in close proximity, and you're generating the perfect conditions to cause a disease or a pathogen to jump between species. And remember, once a disease has jumped once, it increases its ability to jump a second time. So placing these animals in these highly stressful conditions means disease can run rampant amongst them, and then placing them in close contact with a person means that you're generating the sort of perfect conditions for a novel pathogen to jump from one species to another and then to a person. So these sorts of markets where you have animals in close contact with each other under stressful conditions for long periods and in contact with people is a perfect setup for a disease outbreak. Other things we can do? Well, reducing urban sprawl, reducing encroachment into natural areas. And one of the ways that that's been proposed is doing something called build up, not out, to reduce suburban sprawl. Because this up, not out reduces encroachment into wild spaces. I just wanted to show a couple of examples of this. So this is a place in Sydney that is a building that was right opposite the university I used to work at. It's in Central Park. And this building won an awful lot of design awards recently because this is building up, not out, and building a green landscape. So this building has gardens built into the side of it all the way up, and also all the balconies. So each one of these is an apartment. Each one of these little balconies here, that's an apartment. And so what happens is you've got loads of plant life growing around the building. This reduces the temperature, and it also just makes the place nicer to look at and live in. It means you're surrounded by green the whole time in your apartment, and it's nice and cool. In addition, this sector here is a lovely swimming pool with gardens all around it. This structure here reflects the sunlight down into the swimming pool, so it means the pool is usable for longer periods of time and doesn't need heating. It's a fantastic building, won loads of awards. It's really nice to hang out in. There's a food court down in this section, which is lovely as well. It's a really nice place. And it was done on purpose because the amount of people that can be housed in this building is really, really large, but they're living in an area that feels relatively natural. You compare its footprint to how big of an area you would need to do if you built out, not up. If you build out, not up, now the amount of area you need to house this many people is enormous. And it means lots of encroaching into wild spaces, as opposed to this, which is literally in the middle of a major city. And this building up, not out, reduces urban sprawl, and it reduces encroachment into wild spaces, which reduces contact with wildlife. One of the big ones that could have a big impact here in the US is reducing factory farming or meat consumption generally. Because factory farms, just like those live animal markets, they create perfect conditions for disease outbreaks. Because once again, you've got lots and lots of animals living in very high stress conditions, which reduces their immune system, living in close proximity to each other in difficult conditions, and then they're having contact with people. It's not an accident or it's not a coincidence that we keep getting big outbreaks of swine flu and bird flu when the vast majority of our food is produced in these high density, high stress factory farms, and then we're having contact with people. And where possible, we should avoid contact with novel exotic species. We've been in contact with some of our domestic species for decades, centuries, and even millennia. The cow was domesticated thousands of years ago, same with the cat and the dog. Which means we've been interacting with those species and their sort of pathogens for hundreds of years. The idea of domesticating a new species presents new opportunities for disease. If we decide we want a new species as a farm animal, we want a new species as a pet, when we bring that species into close contact with people, we are bringing all of the diseases that are present in that species with it. So that's presenting new opportunities for new diseases to jump into people. In addition, close contact with wild species means diseases can jump. So if we're coming into close contact with wild animals that we might not have done before, that increases the chance that a disease could jump through. So what this means is, well, things like the Tiger King, well, that's just not a good idea for many reasons, but putting people into close proximity with large wild animals means that we can start having disease jump backwards and forwards. Very famously, at the start of the COVID-19 outbreak, the tigers in the Bronx Zoo tested positive for COVID-19 because we have this close proximity of large animals and people. In addition, bringing in new pets just because they're cute. So there was a fashion a while ago for getting slow loris, which is actually a primate, having those as pets. Well, this pet trade is really rather cruel, and it's also very dangerous. The more closely related a species is to people, the more likely the diseases it carries can jump. The slow loris is a primate, so that means it's very closely related to us. And when people wanted them as pets, they wanted these slow loris because they cling to you. And so they're in very close proximity the whole time. The slow loris, unfortunately, is highly nocturnal. That's why it has these gigantic, incredibly cute eyes. It usually lives in the dark. People forced it to be awake in the light, which means they were basically getting blinded a little bit the whole time. And also it brings in all of the novel zoonotic diseases that were present in the slow loris are getting brought into close contact with people. In addition, tourism. There are some places where you can get very close to very charismatic wildlife. This is Rwanda, Uganda, where you can go and hang out with the wild mountain gorillas that have been habituated to people. People get very, very close to these gorillas, and there have been documented cases of Ebola and COVID being transferred between wild gorillas and tourists because we're now in very close proximity with these wild species. So what it means is, where possible, avoid contact with novel exotic species because it presents new opportunities for diseases to jump between species. So, I have to admit that while fun, feeding these wild pygmy marmosets, a primate in Brazil, was a terrible idea. So although I did enjoy it, I mean, look at the big beaming grin on my face. These little tiny monkeys would come down to this place near where we were staying, and you could feed them fruit and they would climb on you a little bit. It was very cute and it makes very good pictures, but this is a terrible idea. Being in close contact with a wild primate that exists in these large groups, it was not my finest moment, I have to admit. But one of the things we have to think about is, well, these zoonotic diseases are common and they're probably here to stay generally. Because zoonotic diseases such as COVID-19, well, they're diseases that transmitted from animals to humans. In recent years, 75% of newly emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. 75%, 3/4 of all the new diseases we encounter are there because they've jumped from animals to people. In addition, 60% of infectious diseases in humans are spread from animals. And it's estimated that zoonotic diseases are responsible for an estimated 2.5 billion cases of illness and 2.7 million deaths worldwide each year. They're a huge deal, especially because now we're in contact with a lot of people. There's lots of contact between people and animals. So they're here to stay. So what we need to focus on is reducing the impact. And reducing the impact requires transparency and global forward planning. So things like here in the US, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, they had a large pandemic planning group present inside this particular body. This group was instigated by President George Bush and had been responsible for pandemic planning for a very long time. Unfortunately, this body had an awful lot of its power and resources stripped by the previous administration, including the Pandemic Planning Committee, which was a bit of a mistake. In addition, things like the World Health Organization, this global body that is monitoring the world health, they are responsible for pandemic planning globally, but critically, they require transparency and rapid information quickly. Okay. So, as far as I want to get to in this class, you guys should now be able to describe what a zoonotic disease is and give examples, analyse the threat posed by different potential disease pathways, and interpret some data on the spread of zoonotic diseases. Okay, that's as far as I wanted to get to. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.